Like, hey guys, do you all know about this thing called addiction? So, let's time travel back to the 1900s, right? There was this brainy guy in London who found something called dopamine. At first, everyone thought it was like this totally boring chemical, but after some experiments, these scientists were like, OMG, this is weird. They noticed that when the conditions were just right, people totally couldn't resist doing things that activated their dopamine and made them feel all happy. And then, some of these guys started calling it the pleasure chemical and named the path it followed in our brains the reward system. But wait, it gets weirder. When other scientists tried to redo these experiments, they stumbled upon something totally unexpected. And this was the beginning of the end for our pleasure chemical dopamine. The big reveal was that dopamine isn't really about pleasure at all. It was like creating this super big emotion that was way more powerful. So, today we're gonna spill the tea about the true nature of dopamine and explain the whole mechanism behind addiction. Isn't that, totally interesting? There's this super old question people have been thinking about forever. It's all about whether people are moved by punishment or rewards. You know, the whole carrot versus stick thing. Believe it or not, this philosophical question was solved in the 1900s. Cue to 1953 in Montreal. These two dudes, Olds and Milner, who were grad students at McGill University, were about to start this crazy experiment. They were planning to anesthetize rats, stick electrodes directly into their brains, and check their reaction to electric stimulation. I mean, putting electrodes into brains sounds totally scary, right? But then, they accidentally placed the electrodes somewhere they didn't mean to. Afterward, they put the rat in this big square box. Inside the box, there was a lever, and when the rat pushed it, it could give itself an electric shock directly in the brain. And guess what happened next? The result was totally shocking. The rat kept pressing the lever 7,000 times in an hour. The place where Olds and Milner accidentally stuck the electrode was in the mediocortical limbic circuit, which later got the name reward circuit. This was the backstory of discovering the pleasure circuit of the reward system. And what you get when this reward system is activated is dopamine. After this, dopamine, which was thought to be some insignificant chemical, totally became a superstar. The discovery of the reward system was totally by accident, guys. At first, they were just trying to find the circuit that controls curiosity, but OMG, they found something way beyond that level in the brain. Then, they decided to experiment to see how powerful the stimulation to this reward system could be. Check this out. Even when there was food nearby, or when a female rat in heat was present, the rats wouldn't care. They just kept on pressing that lever. Even mama rats who just had babies would ignore their little ones and just press the lever. And guess what? Even when they got an electric shock as punishment for approaching the lever, they would just keep pressing like crazy. If left alone, the rats would starve to death because they were so into pressing the lever more than eating. I mean, how crazy is that, right? So, it turns out dopamine is stronger than hunger, sex drive, and all those basic needs of a living being. From this experiment, it became mainstream to think that brains of animals, including humans, prioritize rewards over punishment. It became clear that human behavior is driven by pleasure, not by punishment. The idea of rewards is overwhelmingly stronger than the fear of punishments like electric shocks or starving to death. In later experiments, it was found that dopamine is released from the brain when eating or mating. And from this, the principle of human behavior was revealed. It was proven that people eat not because they fear the punishment of starvation, but because they get dopamine from eating. Totally mind-blowing, right? You guys ever noticed how sometimes you're not hungry, but you still totally want to eat? You know, when you smell something super yummy, even though you're not even hungry. It's the brain's way of training us isn't by punishment, but by rewards. We all kind of grow up by being rewarded by our brains. And then it was confirmed that even when you're sniffing cocaine, the dopamine reward system gets all activated. It became super clear that dopamine is in charge of our pleasure. And it turned out that the reason for drug addiction is dopamine. Why is dopamine so strong, right? I kinda wish that through evolution, we could have been a little more resistant to dopamine, you know? Addiction is so scary and everything. Let's talk about another experiment that scientists conducted to investigate this. After the discovery of dopamine in the reward system, what piqued the scientists' interest was what triggers the release of dopamine. You might think it's when you feel pleasure, but it's not that simple. The answer was revealed during an experiment where they were investigating the relationship between a rat's diet and dopamine. When a rat eats food, dopamine is released, but as the days went by, the amount of dopamine being released decreased. Did the rat get tired of the food? But the rats didn't seem tired of the food during the experiment. They seemed to be eating with the same enthusiasm every day. Despite that, only the amount of dopamine decreased, and gradually dopamine stopped being activated. So why did this happen? The answer was revealed in an experiment conducted by Wolfram Schultz at the University of Cambridge using monkeys. In this experiment, they first implanted electrodes in the monkey's brain reward system to measure the timing of dopamine release. They then prepared two boxes, A and B, each with a light bulb on top. They set up a device where food would be randomly placed in either box A or B, and when food was placed, the light bulb on the box would light up. The monkey was able to open the box and eat the food. Now here's a question for you guys. When do you think the monkey's dopamine was released? You'd probably guess it was when the monkey found and ate the food in the box, right? As you'd expect, initially the monkey didn't know the rule about the light bulbs, so dopamine was released when it randomly found and ate the food in the box. But after a while, the monkey understood the rule about the light bulbs and eventually started opening the box that had the lit bulb. What the researchers didn't expect happened when the monkey understood this rule about the bulbs. At that point, the timing of dopamine release changed from when the monkey found the food to the moment the light bulb lit up. In other words, just the light bulb lighting up caused the release of dopamine. The timing of dopamine release shifted from actually eating to just the anticipation of eating. From this, a hypothesis was born that dopamine is not responding to perception, but accurately to possibility and expectation. It was suggested that dopamine not only causes pleasure, but also promotes actions to achieve pleasure. In other words, the essence of dopamine is anticipation of the future, and this anticipation is called reward prediction error. Dopamine reacts not to the size of the reward itself, but to the size of the error from the expected reward. People are happier with a small, unexpected happy event than a large happy event that is expected. A gamble that hits 1 out of 100 times is more captivating than one that hits 100 out of 100 times. Dopamine reacts most to this error. The reason why people are seeking stronger drugs is because dopamine is seeking the error of predicted rewards. When the error of the expected pleasure by drugs disappears, people seek greater pleasure and end up taking even stronger drugs. Conversely, if the expected reward is not obtained, dopamine rapidly stops its activity and leaves a strong sense of loss. The feeling of loss when you were supposed to have a day off tomorrow, but suddenly you're told to come into work is due to this negative error. This idea that dopamine is all about our future expectations totally explains two things about us humans, right? First, there's that whole thing when your crush loses their spark. You can be totally head over heels for someone, but then you get used to them, and there aren't any surprises, so there's no dopamine release. I mean, that's basically what's happening. Then there's the second thing. It's like dopamine is crazy powerful. We have two types of pleasures, right? There's biological pleasure from stuff like eating and, well, doing it. And then there's reward-based pleasure, like when you work hard to grow crops or study for exams. Dopamine gets super active during the process of going after these rewards, which is what we call work excitement. Why, you ask? Because it's totally better for survival if we have more dopamine activity for reward-based pleasure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do something like work hard to grow wheat for a harvest half a year later. So dopamine doesn't just come out when we get the reward, it comes out when we're trying to get it, pushing us to work hard for the future. It's like dopamine is this super strong because it helps us look to the future and work towards it. Thanks to dopamine being released not just during pleasure, but also when we're looking forward to the future, we can resist our immediate desires and work towards our future expectations. Dopamine is like the main engine that propels organisms towards the future. But wait, dopamine also gets active when we eat. So if we get so addicted to drugs, why don't we get food addiction or binge eating disorders? Why are drugs so addictive? Well, to cut to the chase, it's because dopamine activity from drugs is not something that happens in nature. Dopamine evolved to make organisms perform survival actions, like eating and mating, and to motivate us to work for long-term rewards that will be beneficial for survival. At the same time, it has been programmed to not let us become addicted to these things. Like after eating, our satiety centers turn on and we stop eating. So, natural urges have dopamine control circuits within organisms. Without these control circuits, we just keep eating forever until we explode. But here's the thing, humans have only recently started using drugs in the grand scheme of Earth's history, so there's no way we have built-in control circuits for drug-induced dopamine. Therefore, there's only one response the brain can make when drugs are taken. It wants more, stronger, and more often. Alrighty, we're wrapping things up here, you guys. To summarize, dopamine isn't about pleasure, it's all about expectation and possibility. Drugs, for instance, can cause crazy strong addictions, but that's because our bodies just don't have the control circuits that we'd usually have. Addiction has nothing to do with your willpower, okay? It's just how our brains are wired. You can't just snap out of an addiction with a pep talk. Dopamine is always on the lookout for discrepancies with expectation, and it reacts to those. So it keeps seeking stronger pleasures to generate bigger errors than anticipated. Thanks so much for watching, you guys.